A disabled veteran walks into a courtroom, and the judge mocks him, calling him helpless. James Carter, a 45-year-old Army veteran from Atlanta, Georgia, had always been a fighter. But after losing his leg in combat, life threw him one challenge after another. Adjusting to his new reality wasn't easy. Prosthetics, physical therapy, and the constant stares from strangers made every day a battle. Yet, James's toughest fight wasn't against his own body or the world around him. It was against the assumptions people made about him. One day, James found himself in a courtroom in downtown Atlanta. He was fighting for custody of his 8-year-old daughter, Emily. Her mother, his ex-wife, had argued that James's disability made him unfit to care for a child. The judge, Harold Thompson, a stern man in his late 50s, seemed to agree before James even had a chance to speak. As James stood at the podium, leaning on his cane, Judge Thompson interrupted him mid-sentence. "Mr. Carter," he said with a dismissive tone, "let's be honest here. You're a disabled veteran. You can barely take care of yourself. How do you expect to take care of a child?" The courtroom fell silent. James clenched his fists, but he didn't respond. He knew arguing in that moment would only make things worse. The problem wasn't just the judge's words, it was the system itself. James had spent years studying law in his spare time, preparing for moments like this. He knew the odds were stacked against him, but he also knew he couldn't give up. Emily was his world, and he wasn't going to let anyone take her away without a fight. The challenge was clear. James had to prove himself in a system that had already written him off. He wasn't just fighting for custody, he was fighting to show that his disability didn't define him. And he was about to do it in a way no one saw coming. When Judge Thompson dismissed him, James didn't flinch. He had expected this kind of reaction. Years of being underestimated had taught him to stay calm under pressure. Instead of arguing, he reached into his bag and pulled out a thick folder. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, "I'd like to present my case." The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Go ahead, Mr. Carter," he said, though his tone was still skeptical. James began by outlining the flaws in his ex-wife's argument. He cited specific cases where disabled parents had been granted custody, proving that his disability didn't make him unfit. He even referenced a recent ruling from the Georgia Supreme Court that supported his position. As James spoke, the courtroom began to shift. The opposing lawyer, a well-dressed man in his 40s, tried to interrupt, but James was ready. He calmly pointed out inconsistencies in the lawyer's statements and corrected him on a procedural error. "Your Honor," James said, "the opposing counsel has failed to provide any evidence that my disability impacts my ability to care for my daughter. In fact, I'd like to present evidence that shows the opposite." He handed the judge a stack of documents, letters from Emily's teachers, neighbors, and even her pediatrician. Each one testified to James's dedication as a father. One letter from Emily's teacher read, "Mr. Carter is one of the most involved parents I've ever met. He attends every school event, helps Emily with her homework, and has created a stable, loving environment for her." The judge's expression began to change. He flipped through the documents, his earlier skepticism fading. James continued, "Your Honor, I may have lost my leg, but I haven't lost my ability to love, protect, and provide for my daughter. My disability doesn't define me, my actions do." By the time James finished, the courtroom was silent. Even the opposing lawyer looked impressed. Judge Thompson leaned back in his chair, clearly taken aback. "Mr. Carter," he said slowly, "I must admit, I underestimated you. You've made a compelling case." James didn't smile or gloat. He simply nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time, James felt like he was being seen, not as a disabled veteran, but as a father fighting for his child. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Judge Thompson prepared to deliver his ruling. James stood at the podium, his hands resting lightly on his cane. His heart pounded, but his face remained calm. He had done everything he could. Now it was out of his hands. Judge Thompson cleared his throat and looked directly at James. "Mr. Carter," he began, his voice much softer than before, "I owe you an apology." The words hung in the air, and the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. "When you first walked into this courtroom, I made assumptions about you based on your appearance. I was wrong." James felt a lump form in his throat, but he didn't interrupt. The judge continued, "Your presentation today was one of the most thorough and compelling cases I've seen in my career. You've demonstrated not only a deep understanding of the law, but also an unwavering commitment to your daughter." He paused, glancing at the stack of documents James had submitted. "The evidence you've provided, letters from your daughter's teachers, neighbors, and even her doctor, paints a clear picture. You are a dedicated, capable father, and your disability has no bearing on your ability to care for your child." The judge's tone grew firmer as he delivered his final decision. "Therefore, I am granting you full custody of your daughter, Emily. I hope this ruling serves as a reminder to everyone in this courtroom and beyond that true strength isn't measured by what we've lost, but by what we're willing to fight for." For a moment, James couldn't move. The weight of the judge's words and the victory was almost too much to process. He looked over at Emily, who was sitting in the front row with a family friend. Her face lit up with a smile so bright it could have powered the entire city of Atlanta. James finally allowed himself to exhale. He nodded at the judge, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said. As he turned to leave the podium, the courtroom erupted into murmurs of approval. Even the opposing lawyer gave him a respectful nod. This wasn't just a legal victory, it was a moment of redemption. James had walked into that courtroom as a man the world had written off. He walked out as a father who had proven that no one had the right to define his limits. If this story inspired you, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories like this.